The death of John Kennedy Jr. was a terrible loss. The loss of his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren was an unspeakable blow to their families and the other people who loved them. John embodied an extremely rare combination of wealth, charisma, and human decency. As we have seen and will see, the Kennedy family members have lived and died giving their best in service to the people of America and to the world. What might John and Carolyn have done for their country and the world if they had lived? Let's try not to get lost in the swamp of facts surrounding their deaths, and let's try instead to stay rooted in an appreciation of what we lost when they died. In getting started, there are some preliminary points we should discuss. The first has to do with understanding the forces at work in recent and current U.S. history. State-sponsored racism and genocide were invented by the rich and powerful in this country, and their involvement with Hitler cannot be overestimated. For example, Chase Manhattan Bank, the Rockefeller Bank in Paris, seized the assets of their Jewish depositors and then ordered Hitler to tell them to do it, which of course he did. The Nazis who run this country ordered Hitler around. Hitler represented a dictatorship of the rich bastards, of the largest corporations, of the power elite against the Democrats, who think society ought to be run by the people and for the benefit of the people. But the most powerful Nazis were not in Germany, they were right here. The Rockefellers and the Harrimans, the Fords and the DuPonts helped to create Hitler, helped to promote him and armed him. And they didn't lose World War II. Hitler did. The German people did. The Jewish people did. But the Rockefellers and the Harrimans, the Fords and the DuPonts, they won. After 8 years as president, in 1960, Eisenhower finally figured out that he was surrounded by Nazis. He called them the military-industrial complex, and he tried to warn the new president, John Kennedy, that these guys were trying to take over the government and end democracy.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
The Kennedy family has a truly amazing history. Joe, the oldest son, died in a bomber over Germany fighting Nazis. Jack died fighting the Nazis here, the military-industrial complex. They wanted the Vietnam War as an excuse to loot the U.S. Treasury. When as president, John Kennedy Sr. opposed them, they shot him down like a dog in the streets of Dallas. Bobby Kennedy, the third brother, took up the fight against the military-industrial complex and ran for president, promising to end the Vietnam War that his brother was murdered for opposing. Bobby was murdered after winning the California primary.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you.
The murder, as usual, was blamed on a lone nut, Sirhan Sirhan. But the L.A. County coroner, Thomas Noguchi, said that the powder burns on the back of Robert Kennedy's head indicated that the shot was fired from within 1 inch.
We came to conclusion that the muzzle distance would be a 1 inch from the right ear edge.
But the eyewitnesses all said that Sirhan never came near enough to deliver the fatal shot to the back of the head.
And Sirhan was right in front of me, right in front of the steam table and between me.
In front?
In front, yeah. I had him right in front of me. I didn't let him pass me. I had my left foot on his knees, and I pushed him over. And
Well,
time,
how far would the gun muzzle be from Senator Kennedy's head?
about a foot and a half, I would say, 2 feet.
More shots were fired than Sirhan's gun was capable of firing. Sirhan said he did not remember firing the shots and that he had absolutely no reason to hate Robert Kennedy. Many investigators concluded that Sirhan was a victim of mind control, a decoy sent to divert attention while the real killer fired the fatal shot. Edward Kennedy, the fourth brother, after becoming a senator, barely escaped death in a plane crash that broke his back and killed everyone else on board. and his political career was ruined when someone drugged him and drove his car off a bridge. He survived, but his hopes to run for president did not. This is not some stupid, mysterious family curse. For 50 years, the Kennedys have had a heroic family tradition of fighting real Nazis, of defending the democratic interests of the people against other families with anti-democratic traditions. These Nazis have been instrumental in the murders of the Kennedys. These Nazis, the Illuminati, the rich bastards, they are the Kennedy curse. The death of John Kennedy Jr. must be seen in this light. Who would want to kill a harmless boob like John Kennedy Jr.? It's a common question that needs to be answered. John was not a harmless boob, and the men who murdered John's father had good reason to fear that he would go after his father's killers. John was not your average stupid, spoiled rich kid. For example, this was his birthday. He was 3. Not your average birthday party. All the women were dressed in black. His mama was no fool. Minutes after the assassination, they wanted her to change her dress. She said, "No, I want the American people to see what they did to my husband." What they did to my husband. She didn't buy any of this lone nut crap. She did her best to help her children grow up normal and healthy. She didn't send them away to one of those factories where they manufacture rich kids into sick and twisted upper-class scum. She tried hard to keep them normal. But when John wanted to be an actor, she let him know that he had more serious work to do. George Magazine was that work. Infotainment, but real info. Not the stupidifying garbage you get on 150 channels of cable. Entertaining, engaging, but smart and real and important. Perhaps too smart, too real, and too important. He published at least 2 very, very dangerous articles. The first was written by the mother of the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin, the liberal, peace-seeking Prime Minister of Israel. This woman said that Rabin's assassination was a plot engineered by the Mossad, the Israeli CIA. She argued essentially that her son was a tool of the Mossad, that he could never have penetrated the security around Rabin if it weren't an inside job. Wow. Publishing an article that encourages people to consider the possibility that their own security might be involved in attacks on their own citizens based on the fact that those attacks could not have succeeded if the security agencies had done their jobs. I don't think we can overemphasize this point. John Kennedy devoted his life to trying to bring the people the whole, dangerous truth. He paid for this devotion to the people and to the truth with his life. The day John died, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak was in the United States, not to suggest anything as crass as that Barak was involved in John's death. I was in the country too, but I didn't do it. But there can be no question that Barak's visit was preceded by the arrival of an army of security personnel, including, of course, the Mossad. They were here. They arrived in advance of John's death in order to make preparations for the Prime Minister's visit, of course. But after John's death, a Mossad agent planted this lie in the New York Post. And as we have just seen, they had reason to want John Kennedy Jr. dead. Not only did John refuse to endorse the Warren Commission and say, yes, of course, his father had been murdered by a lone nut, how awful. Not only did John refuse to attack Oliver Stone in his movie JFK, but George Magazine published a second very dangerous article, this one written by Oliver Stone himself. The article Stone wrote was about how the rich and powerful have always assassinated their political opponents throughout history, including John's father. John took this guy who said that the rich and powerful forces had killed his father, and he paid him, and he published him, and he actually encouraged people to listen to him as if he had something legitimate to say. Was John incredibly brave or just stupid? I vote for brave. And perhaps most dangerous of all, John was a threat to his father's killers because when he decided to run for political office, he was going to win. Did People magazine pick George W. as the sexiest man in the world? No, they didn't. They picked John. When he spoke in public, he had a natural ease and presence. He was what they call charismatic.
Over a quarter century ago, my father stood before you to accept the nomination for the presidency of the United States. America is better because of the leadership of Edward Kennedy. He has shown that an unwavering commitment to the poor, to the elderly, to those without hope, regardless of fashion or convention, is the greatest reward of public service.
Which brings us to our next introductory point. If there was foul play in the death of John Kennedy Jr., and we will show absolutely conclusively in a few minutes that there was, George W. Bush and his father have to be seen as the prime suspects. It's an obvious point, really. As we saw in JFK II, The Bush Connection, George Herbert Walker Bush helped to supervise the assassination of President Kennedy, and from that moment on, his political future was made. He was a made man. He lost the race for Senate. They gave him a seat in Congress. He lost again for the Senate. They gave him a job in the White House. He lost the primaries to Reagan. They made him vice president, and he ruled while Reagan napped for 8 years. Does little Georgie's political career show such intervention, such involvement by the dark lords of Nazi politics? You be the judge. A few weeks after John Kennedy Jr.'s death, little Georgie lost to John McCain in the New Hampshire primaries. Now, when you lose in New Hampshire, you're supposed to see the rats scurrying from your sinking ship and jumping on board with the winner. After New Hampshire, the money flows from the losers to the winner. That's how it's supposed to go, as water runs downhill and as day follows night. But in 1999, that's not how it went. Water ran uphill. Night was followed by a much deeper darkness, and money flowed like a plague into the coffers of George W. Bush after his loss in New Hampshire. Now, how can you explain this? Why didn't that loss increase financial support for John McCain by the big money establishment? He was clearly more electable. Why did that loss result in a sudden and enormous increase in financial backing for George W.? These millions of dollars allowed Bush to smear and slime McCain's image with incredible vigor, to buy up the endorsements of the religious groups, of the veterans groups, and to call virtually every voter in the state and tell them the lie that McCain had an illegitimate black child. Why did the big money establishment overwhelmingly support Bush at this time instead of siding with McCain? Was it because McCain was a war hero and Bush was a draft dodger? Was it because Bush had been an openly drug-abusing alcoholic and McCain had led a conservative lifestyle? How do you explain it? It's not so difficult. They needed a stooge, someone they could trust to shut up and do what he was told as they planned and executed the murder of 3,000 Americans, to anger the American people into a series of unending wars, killing tens of thousands more, so that they could steal hundreds of billions of dollars from the national treasury. Now, if his father got his seat at this table by killing President Kennedy, who did little Georgie have to kill to get his seat at this table? It's a fair question. And now it's time to ask the key question you always ask your prime suspect. Where was Georgie the night John Kennedy Jr. was murdered? Go to a news retrieval service and search every newspaper in the world. You'll find that Friday, July 16, 1999, the day John Kennedy Jr. died, Bush was in Iowa in the morning, running for president, flipping pancakes and kissing babies. The polls showed that he was losing in New Hampshire to John McCain. You might see this as a crucial weekend for campaigning, but Bush got on a bus at 10 o'clock that Friday morning and disappeared for 3 days. On Saturday, the media ran to Al Gore to ask his response to John Jr.'s death so he could say how sad and sorry he was. And Gore said that he would cancel all his campaign rallies for the weekend out of respect for the family's losses. And then the reporters ran to the Bush campaign headquarters. I mean, here's Bush, a president's son. What does he think of the death of another president's son? That was their angle. And is he going to cancel his campaign appearances like Gore? But do you know what Bush said? Nothing. He was nowhere to be found. His staff couldn't say where he was, what he was doing, or even when he would be back. Although they were sure, they said, that if they could find him, he would of course express his deep sorrow and sympathy for the family's loss. The last preliminary point to be made, based on the events of John's life, is that he was not a W. He was not an inconsequential, drug-using, heavy-drinking, irresponsible boob. He was a responsible, smart, dynamic, responsible, good-hearted, devastatingly handsome, responsible talent with a winning personality and a commitment to make the world a better place. Did I mention how responsible he was? Specifically, and most importantly for us today, he was an enormously responsible pilot. Without a dissenting opinion, the 9 flight instructors who watched John fly over the course of 17 years agreed that he was methodical about his flight planning and very cautious regarding his aviation decision-making. How did such a careful pilot end up crashing into the sea, killing his wife and his sister-in-law, and possibly his unborn child? How? Well, that's what we're here to find out. The National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, investigates all airplane crashes. They found no evidence in this case of any mechanical problems. The weather was clear and the moon was visible. The radar report shows that John's plane just suddenly dropped, as if someone had grabbed the controls, the steering yoke, and pushed it forward as hard as they could. It looks like a suicide. And it's standard in any accident investigation to examine the state of mind of the individuals involved, to assess the possibility that the crash was not an accident at all, but a suicide. So let's do that quickly. John and his wife Carolyn were famous for a fight they had in public, and friends said that for 3 years they had disagreed about whether and when to have children. But in May, 2 months before the crash, John was very upbeat about his marriage and told Toronto businessman Keith Stein that he was looking forward to fatherhood. Stein said, quote, "He talked about having kids as if it were imminent in their future." On John's fatal last Friday, he told his staff not to worry about their jobs because, quote, "As long as I'm alive, this magazine will continue to publish," unquote. This would be a really cruel thing for a guy to say who was planning to kill himself in a few hours. On his last Friday afternoon, John and his wife's sister, Lauren, arrived at the Essex County Airport in Caldwell, New Jersey at 7:30. Witnesses say Carolyn arrived 15 minutes later at 7:45, and yet, while conditions worsened as the skies became more and more hazy as the sun went down, they sat around for 45 minutes. Why? What were they waiting for? This is an anomaly. It doesn't make any sense. In any case, at 8:30, 45 minutes after arriving, John, his sister-in-law, Lauren, and his wife took off from Caldwell, New Jersey, and headed northeast towards Martha's Vineyard, ascending to a cruising altitude of 5,500 feet. An NTSB radar analysis shows the final moments of the flight in great detail. At 9:33, the plane, still headed northeast, began descending from its cruising altitude of 5,500 feet. At 9:38, the plane, while still descending, began a slight turn to the right so that it was headed due east, lining itself up with the southern coast of Martha's Vineyard. This was John's favorite approach to the Martha's Vineyard Airport, since it allowed him to fly over his mother's home on the southern shore, where he spent many childhood summers. At 9:38 and 20 seconds, the plane completed the turn and stopped its descent. The plane was now at 2,200 feet. But it's against FAA regulations for a plane to fly below 2,500 feet without first contacting the tower. So in a manner which is absolutely typical of John's carefulness in following procedures, he brought the plane back up to 2,500 feet. At 9:38 and 50 seconds, with wings level, the plane was on final approach with 14 miles to go to the airport. At 200 miles per hour, the plane would land in about 5 minutes. At 9:39, John contacted the tower. We don't know how long this conversation lasted, but at 9:40 and 15 seconds, 1 minute and 15 seconds later, the plane suddenly dove out of the sky, falling 2,500 feet in 45 seconds, crashing into the water at 200 miles per hour.
We have been told by the Coast Guard that, in fact, there is now evidence of a last communication last night with JFK Jr.'s plane as it was making an approach to Martha's Vineyard Airport. Petty Officer Todd Burgun joins us from the Coast Guard base in Boston. He is the a petty officer and a public information officer. Thank you for being with us, sir. What can you tell us about this last communication with JFK Jr.'s plane?
All I really know at this time is that it was at 9:39 p.m. and it was with the FAA, and it was on its final approach to Martha's Vineyard.
So at 9:39, to the best of your information, JFK Jr. made a contact with the airport, with the flight controllers, the air traffic controllers at Martha's Vineyard Airport, that he was on a final descent.
That is correct.
At 9:39.
Todd Burgun is a professional. What you heard him doing just now is what he does every day. He answers reporters' questions about the Coast Guard's involvement in rescues of plane and ship disasters. We have seen that at precisely 9:39, the plane had stopped descending and paused at 2,500 feet. FAA regulations require that the plane pause at 2,500 feet, contact the tower, and receive permission to continue. And Burgun reports that it was at this precise moment, 9:39, that Kennedy did in fact contact the tower. Burgun's report is absolutely consistent with the radar information that we got from the NTSB that was used to reconstruct the last moments of the plane before it crashed. Burgun's report is absolutely credible. If he had been off by 1 minute on either side, if he had said 9:38, he'd have been wrong. The plane was still executing the turn and was not yet on final approach. If he had said 9:40, he'd have been wrong. The plane was on its way into the water. How was he able to identify the exact minute that the plane was holding at 2,500 feet, waiting to get clearance from the tower before descending? He had to have gotten that information from FAA flight personnel in the tower at Martha's Vineyard Airport, that Kennedy indeed contacted the tower at 9:39. There is no other possible explanation. This question of radio contact with the Martha's Vineyard Tower is enormously important for a couple of reasons. You see, whenever you contact air traffic control, your particular radar blip is then entered into the FAA's air traffic computer system. If anywhere on your flight path your plane should happen to descend below 100 feet, the computer will immediately set off an alarm at the FAA traffic control facility. So therefore, as a result of Kennedy's 9:39 radio contact with the tower, the plane should have set off a low-altitude alarm in the FAA's traffic control offices when the plane descended below 100 feet. The FAA should have begun the search at 9:40 when this low-altitude alarm went off. They knew before the plane hit the water. FAA regulations also require that a search be begun any time a plane contacts the tower on its final approach and then fails to land within 5 minutes. As a result of John Kennedy's radio contact with the tower then, the FAA also should have begun a search at 9:44 when John Kennedy's plane failed to land. How long did it take the FAA to begin searching the approaches to the Martha's Vineyard Airport? If this outrageous delay was actually part of a criminal conspiracy, then it's obvious that this information about John Kennedy contacting the tower would have to be disappeared. And it was disappeared. At 12:30, Burgun was removed. He was silenced. He disappeared from any further reports of any kind. In fact, all government agencies, including the FAA and the Coast Guard, suddenly went silent, and reporters were now referred to the Pentagon. That's right. Suddenly the Pentagon became the center for reporting what was supposedly a peacetime activity of search and rescue, resulting from a peacetime accident.
All right, we're told the Pentagon news conference is about to get underway. Let's go there right now.
This is an easily used facility. Both the Department of Defense and the Coast Guard, and to try to describe to you what...
The Pentagon overtly took control of the news reporting of the crash. This was certainly extraordinary. And Lieutenant Colonel Steve Rourke was brought out to do the official line.
I only know for sure that they did not talk to the tower at Martha's Vineyard.
No need to mention Todd Burgun's report, because it now officially never happened. Nothing to see here, folks. Now let's move on.
Along the route, they may have spoken to somebody, but not at Martha's Vineyard.
Certainly not at Martha's. They never made contact with the tower at Martha's Vineyard.
That's my understanding.
Colonel Rourke is lying. There's no way that Burgun's report could be false. None. The news people didn't believe Rourke for 1 second, and they continued all through the day to report what Bergen had told them.
10 o'clock, and as we've been telling you all afternoon, his last contact with Martha's Vineyard Airport was apparently at 9:39 with air traffic controllers about 17 miles off of Martha's Vineyard, and that is now...
Of course, if they wanted to make Bergen's report go away, the killers also had to shut down the honest people at FAA who had told Bergen about the tower contact, and they did.
Do you have any knowledge about that, or whether they contacted Otis, or whether they contacted any other tower within the region?
No, I do not have any more information, and the FAA would be a better point of contact. I have time for one
waiting to hear from the Federal Aviation Administration on anything they might add as a result of listening to the tapes, the conversations between, the transmissions between the airplane, John F. Kennedy Jr.'s airplane, and air traffic controllers on the ground.
Your sister-in-law.
It would be really interesting to hear from the Federal Aviation Administration. They must have by now listened to the audio tapes of the air traffic controllers' conversations with JFK Jr.'s airplane from the time that it left. I'm surprised that we haven't heard anything from the FAA just yet.
Hopefully we will hear something from them soon that will give us an indication of what might have gone wrong.
From the radar screens, the FAA has said nothing this afternoon. We've only heard from the Coast Guard officials and for the Civil Air Patrol people, but this is what we have. With JFK Jr.'s plane.
This report by the official Coast Guard spokesman was probably the most significant piece of information that appeared in the early reports and was then washed away. But it certainly wasn't the only piece of professional, on-the-scene reporting that was disappeared from the news by the conspirators at the Pentagon.
At about 02:15 this morning, Coast Guard Operations Center at Group Woods Hole in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, received a telephone call from a family friend indicating that John F. Kennedy, his wife Carolyn Bessette, and his sister-in-law Lauren Bessette, who had earlier departed from Caldwell Airport in Fairfield, New Jersey, were late in arriving at Martha's Vineyard.
Now wait. John Kennedy Jr.'s plane was expected at the family home at 10. Friends of Lauren's were expecting her at the Martha's Vineyard Airport at 9:30, but no one reported the plane missing for 4 hours, not until 2 a.m.? That's not a very believable story, is it? And it's not true either.
Connection at that point, because that's a question that I've had. If they knew the plane was missing, and this is what I heard earlier this morning, that there were family members, a family member of Lauren, or a friend of Lauren Bessette, the sister-in-law of John Kennedy Jr., Carolyn's husband. They were apparently waiting for her at the airport, and when she didn't arrive...
These friends of Lauren Bessette, waiting for her at the Martha's Vineyard Airport, contacted Adam Budd, a licensed pilot and airport employee who first contacted the Martha's Vineyard Tower and then called FAA officials in Bridgeport, Connecticut to report that, quote, Kennedy Jr.'s plane was overdue. Any one of these phone calls should have caused the FAA to begin a search. Instead, FAA officials did nothing.
Rescue and search crews were contacted early this morning when family members expecting the Kennedys at Martha's Vineyard at about 10 o'clock heard nothing, contacted the airport, were told there had been no word from the plane. They contacted FAA officials who then...
In response to these phone calls, the FAA officials did nothing. 1 hour later, at 11 p.m., Senator Edward Kennedy became involved. He contacted the FAA to let them know that the plane was missing. A U.S. senator is going to be able to get some action, right? Wrong. The FAA officials did nothing. Pretty outrageous. And as you can imagine, it attracted the attention of the reporters trying to cover the story, and they tried to grill Colonel Rourke about this outrageous discrepancy.
Linda Killian from People magazine. I just wonder if there's any information about why, when the plane was expected in about 9:30, if there's any idea why you were not notified until 3 in the morning, and how important...
Well, now you see why the Pentagon had to take over the press coverage. That way, if some terrorist like Linda Killian at People magazine tried to throw a bomb or ask a good question, they could just cut her off. This question of why the plane was not officially reported missing until 2 a.m. never got answered, never got asked again, and never got any mention in any of the media. But so did the Kennedys just give up trying to get a search started? No, they didn't. At 2:15 a.m., a family friend, Carol Radowell, got the bright idea to contact the Coast Guard. The plane was flying over water. Perhaps the Coast Guard could act on its own and search the water, even if the FAA was refusing to cooperate and search the skies. But let's first acknowledge here that if a plane is missing and you call the Coast Guard instead of the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, it's either because you're retarded and you don't know the difference between flying a plane and sailing a boat, or it's because you have exhausted all hope of getting the FAA to act. The Kennedys aren't retarded. By 2:15 in the morning, they were desperate and they called the Coast Guard to look for a plane. The Coast Guard cooperated, I guess you could call it that. They contacted the FAA. Ay, Meshuggah. But at least now the FAA was on notice that another government agency was involved. They had to do something, and so the FAA did something. The FAA contacted the Air Force, the government agency most obviously criminally involved in the events of September 11th. The Air Force contacted the Coast Guard, letting them know that the Air Force, not the Coast Guard, was now in charge, letting them know that the Coast Guard should now do what the military tells them to do, and the Air Force then sent the Coast Guard on a wild goose chase to search an area 100 miles away from anywhere the plane might have gone down. Meanwhile, from 2 a.m. until 7:30 a.m., the Air Force and the FAA did nothing. At 6:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning, Ted Kennedy woke up John Podesta, Clinton's chief of staff. At 7 a.m., Podesta woke up Clinton. At 7:15, Clinton told Podesta to call the Air Force and tell them that if they didn't have a search underway in 15 minutes, they shouldn't bother to come to work on Monday because they would all be fired if they weren't in jail. The Air Force said, "Oh, you want a search? We'll give you a search," and they scattered 2 planes and 2 helicopters across 20,000 square miles of ocean. The Air Force kept them searching this vast expanse for the next 5.5 hours. Now, obviously, not everybody at FAA was involved in a criminal conspiracy, with Colonel Rourke and the Air Force and the Pentagon. After all, Bergen got his information about the tower contact from some honest person at the FAA, and many other professionals at FAA also did their jobs as usual. For example, studying the radar tapes of Kennedy's flight, performing what is called an NTAP radar analysis. The name of this type of review of the radar records, NTAP, means that you go back to takeoff. You start with the plane identifying itself to the tower, giving its N number, its registration number. In this case, N529JK. The plane's radar blip is identified at takeoff, and this particular blip is then followed along its flight path until it disappears, indicating the crash site. The New York Times says this information was available at 5 a.m. and hard-working, honest news people with contacts at FAA got a hold of this radar information, and they put it into their TV broadcasts, and they put it up on the screen at the same moment that they were asking Colonel Rourke to explain why, 8 hours after the results of the NTAP radar study were available, the search vessels were still scattered all over the Atlantic, when the radar showed definitively that the plane had gone down on the western approach to Martha's Vineyard.
Colonel Rourke, Martha Raddatz from ABC. ABC is reporting today that the plane possibly went into a dive about 19 miles off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. Does that mean the search will start focusing right there and you will pull away from, say, Long Island or other areas you're searching, or will you pretty much go about what you're doing?
We'll continue on the same track that we're on, which is to search the entire area. We have nothing that absolutely pinpoints one area as opposed to another, so we can't rule out the entire flight.
The reporter can't believe what she's hearing. Can it be that this guy, the spokesman for a day, chosen by the Air Force, doesn't even know about the radar information? So she asks him.
Are you hearing those reports at all about 19 miles off Martha's Vineyard? The radar...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The radar indicated that at some point that the plane may have gone into a dive?
The radar position is just a last possible position, and it's...
The radar position was not just a last possible position. It was a crash site. This is the official radar report from the NTSB documents. The plane dropped 1,200 feet in the first 12 seconds. This is 12 times what would be considered a normal rate of descent. The next 30 seconds is probably 50 times normal. The plane then disappeared from the radar. Rourke had this information, but this is not an area of special interest to him? And Colonel Rourke didn't simply misspeak at the press conference. He told this lie to anyone who would listen, including the New York Times. But back at the Pentagon press conference, the lying is just getting started.
Just a last possible position, and it's can't even be confirmed that it's the aircraft we're looking for. So again, we can't rule
It can be confirmed. It had been confirmed. Remember, the NTAP radar study begins by identifying the plane at takeoff. So again, Rourke is lying. But let's take a moment to clarify who this Colonel Steve Rourke is.
Lieutenant Colonel Steve Rourke, R-O-A-R-K. He's currently the director of the U.S. Air Force's National Search and Rescue School, which is at the U.S. Coast Guard Station in Yorktown, Virginia. He is the former director of the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center. He is physically in the Rescue Coordination Center right now.
So Steve Rourke is very senior. He is the former director of the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center.
Colonel Rourke is a HH-53 helicopter pilot. He's personally been involved in over 1,000 rescues, search and rescue operations in his career. And Steve, are you there?
Yes, sir, I am here.
Colonel Rourke may not know anything about what happened to John Kennedy Jr., but he does know about search and rescue in general. He's intimately familiar with what an NTAP means. He must be vastly familiar with radar tapes. So Colonel Rourke's errors are not simple mistakes. He's lying his head off. But you answer the question, why? I guess "I don't know why" is a perfectly legitimate answer to that question. But can't we do better than that? Can we find any other evidence that suggests a more qualified, more specific, more useful answer than "I don't know"? I think so. The obvious answer is that they were trying to keep the rescue craft out of the crash area.
Our search, and by about 1 o'clock this afternoon, we had narrowed that focus down to an area of about 17 miles southwest of Martha's Vineyard, consistent with the kind of flight path that we would expect flying VFR from Caldwell, New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard. At about that same
You get the point. The FAA knew where Kennedy's plane had gone down before it hit the water. The NTAP radar study verifying where Kennedy's plane had crashed was completed at 5 a.m., but Rourke and the Air Force kept the Coast Guard searching this vast expanse for the next 5.5 hours. It wasn't until after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when a suitcase washed up on the beach with Lauren Bessette's name tag on it, that the Coast Guard, acting on its own, was finally able to focus on something remotely resembling the crash area. One last point on this question. All civil aircraft are required to carry an emergency beacon, or an ELT. These emergency locator transmitters are crash activated. If a plane crashes, the ELT sends out a signal that is received by a network of satellites that can instantly locate the crash within a matter of a few feet. So, where did ABC get the information for this picture, which shows a beacon in the crash area? Obviously, the beacon went off as it was supposed to, the signal was received by the satellites as it was supposed to be, and, although news reporters at ABC managed to get a hold of this information, it was not passed on to the rescue teams in the Coast Guard and the Civil Air Patrol. But we already know how that works. The question then is why? Why didn't Rourke and the others involved in this criminal conspiracy want the searchers to know where to search? Again, "I don't know" is a pretty legitimate answer, but, again, can't we do better? Well, let's keep putting together the pieces we can and see what kind of picture we get. At 2 a.m., as soon as the Coast Guard tried to involve itself, the military took charge of the search. As we've seen, they hit or destroyed many pieces of vital information. In addition, the Mafia, the military, and their accomplices have also seen fit to lose many crucial pieces of information which are essential to our being able to see and understand what happened. Through dumb luck and hard work and invaluable help from others, we've been able to replace many of these missing pieces.
We also heard that they picked up a a radio beacon, the emergency beacon that these airplanes are equipped with, and they're set to go off on impact.
We now know, for example, that it is more than likely that John's emergency beacon, the ELT, went off and was received, but that this piece of the puzzle was removed. We can easily replace it. We found out that Adam Budd reported the plane missing at 10 o'clock. We found pieces of the puzzle that show the family, including Senator Kennedy, also made reports, beginning only a short while after Adam Budd's report at 10 p.m. and continuing throughout the night. The NTAP radar information, as well as the news that John Kennedy contacted the Martha's Vineyard Tower on his final approach, also got lost. As a result, 15.5 hours of search time were also lost. And what emerges from this scene is a conspiracy between the upper levels of the Air Force and FAA to manipulate events, draw a false picture of John as a careless and incompetent pilot, and to prevent the search and rescue teams from arriving at the crash area for as long as possible. And there are more missing pieces. For example, all of John's flight instructors would be shocked to find out that, according to Colonel Rourke and his friends, on this particular flight, John did not follow two of the most basic and routine safety procedures. He did not, according to the bad guys, file a flight plan. And they say he did not contact any of the radar facilities along the route of his flight to Martha's Vineyard. The reason for filing a flight plan with the FAA is that it tells the search and rescue people where to look for you if you go missing. John had always filed a flight plan before on all of his previous trips, but not this time. The missing flight plan is one of the main reasons given by Rourke and his friends for the 15-hour delay locating the crash. There are also several good reasons that a careful and conscientious pilot like John would always contact the air traffic control radar facilities along the route of a flight. First, contacting the controllers allows them to warn you of any hazards in your area. For example, if a jumbo jet has engine trouble and unexpectedly has to turn around and then comes barreling up behind you, the controllers can warn you, if you contact them, to watch out, and they can tell you where to go to get out of the way. If a storm develops suddenly and comes sweeping into your flight path, the controllers can warn you, if you contact them. In addition, when you contact them, the air traffic controllers give you an identifying radar code that you punch into a device on your plane called a radar transponder. Your onboard radar transponder then sends out a signal, which is picked up by the FAA's radar, so that your radar blip now tells them exactly who you are and what your altitude is. And, as we discussed before, when you contact the controllers, they enter your transponder's blip into the computer system, so that if your plane descends below 100 feet anywhere but on the runway of your target airport, an alarm goes off in the FAA air traffic control facility, telling the controllers to send a search and rescue team to come and get you. So contacting the controllers or not contacting them is not exactly a small deal, and it was unheard of for John not to follow such a basic procedure. So Rourke and his friends say that John Kennedy never contacted anyone and never filed a flight plan, and idiots like this guy point to this as evidence to show that John was a careless, irresponsible daredevil who deserved to die. But, given Rourke's record of lying about everything else, the fact that Rourke says anything certainly doesn't mean that we should believe it, maybe the opposite. And given John's 17-year record of careful, meticulous adherence to safety procedures, it seems more than likely that John did file a flight plan and that he did contact the air traffic control facilities along the route, but that his flight plan and all of his contacts with air traffic control somehow became missing pieces. John's plane had a simple cockpit voice recorder that should have preserved a record of the conversations and noise that took place during the last 5 minutes of the flight. But when the plane was recovered, the backup battery, which was necessary to preserve this information, was missing. And so, therefore, this critical information of what happened during John and Carolyn and Lauren's last moments is also missing. Is it possible that during the 15-hour delay, or later after the plane was recovered, that someone removed the battery in order to prevent us from knowing what transpired in the final minutes of the flight? But what would they accomplish by doing such a thing? What could they have been trying to hide? At this point, we can't even begin to guess. Witnesses saw John talking on the phone in the minutes before he took off. Who was he talking to? And what was he talking about? It's a small piece, and maybe unimportant, but at this point it attracts our attention because it's missing. It's supposed to be in the report. The NTSB is supposed to investigate this question. It's their routine to do so, and for obvious reasons. I mean, what if Kennedy had threatened to kill himself and his wife during this phone call? That would be important. Was he telling relatives not to wait up for him? That would help to explain the delay if it were true. Was he talking to a flight instructor, making plans or canceling plans? We don't know. The NTSB has the phone record. Given the clear evidence in this case of a conspiracy by Rourke and others to hide the truth about what happened, the fact that it's missing should automatically attract our attention. Our response should be, it's missing, it must be important. Those who knew John's personal flying habits say that John kept his flight log in an aquamarine duffel on his plane. Witnesses familiar with John, his flight log, and this duffel were watching the news of the crash on CNN and saw this duffel being recovered among the debris from the crash. CNN's website also covered the story of the debris recovered after the crash and quotes a witness who specifically mentions this duffel as among items recovered by the police after it washed up on the beach at Martha's Vineyard, and you'll notice that this bag was described as being intact. So what? Well, according to the witnesses, if the bag was intact, it would have contained John's flight log. Again, so what? Who cares? I mean, why would anyone want to hide the flight log from us? Well, the flight log records who was on the plane, and it does this for one principal reason, so that if the plane crashes, we can recover the flight log and verify who was on the plane. Then we know how many bodies, living or dead, we should be looking for. The insurance companies know whose policy they have to pay out on and whose they don't. To the insurance companies, anyway, answering the question of who was on the plane is not a small deal. This question will become even more important in just a minute. Right now, the most important lesson I need you to have learned from the murder of JFK is how to smell a rat. Please recall how we saw that the reports from professional, reliable, on-the-scene witnesses of shots from the front disappeared. They were replaced by unsubstantiated reports that all the shots came from behind. The point is this: when rich and powerful bastards are killing a Democratic leader, our best chance to find out the truth will come from the earliest reports. When we see these early reports from responsible, knowledgeable persons replaced by unsubstantiated reports from people with no name, no experience, the wrong job title, and no credibility, we should resist. We should demand to see credible, substantiated, supporting evidence before accepting the new version that someone is trying to sell us. We need to recognize that this exchanging of bad information for good by itself is evidence that supports a charge of conspiracy to murder.
At this point, according to what the family has told us, it is believed that Kennedy was the pilot of the plane and that, in fact, he was the only pilot on board. There had been earlier reports that perhaps there had been a fourth passenger, a flight instructor. According to the family and what they have told us, that is not the case. The family is also saying that they are not sure that JFK Jr. had the proper license to pilot the plane last night, though the FAA has in fact not confirmed that.
Now let's slow down and examine this statement very carefully. What does it tell us? The earliest reports said that there was a flight instructor on the plane. Please recognize then that the idea that a flight instructor was on the plane should not be casually dismissed, even if later some nameless person, known only as the family, began running around telling all the media a couple of really controversial things. Let's take the second part about John Kennedy's pilot's license first.
The family is also saying that they are not sure that JFK Jr. had the proper license to pilot the plane last night, though the FAA has in fact not confirmed that.
Jeez, John Kennedy didn't even have a license? What the hell did he think he was doing? Careless, irresponsible, stupid rich kid, acting like a daredevil with his wife on board. Too bad about her, but hell, he deserved to die. This is the kind of ugly truth you would think the family might want to keep quiet about. But what if it weren't true? What kind of family member would say it to the press if it weren't true? It wasn't true.
He was qualified. He had a private pilot single-engine land license, which qualified him to fly this particular airplane under visual flight rules. The weather observation at the Martha's Vineyard Airport at 9 o'clock was 8 miles visibility. That's well above the minimums needed for visual flight rules. At 10 o'clock, it was 10 miles. We've heard from a number of people who were down on the Vineyard and on the Cape last night that the moon was visible. So it's pretty apparent that the sky was not, there was no cloud cover, at least not a significant cloud cover. So 6 or 8 miles visibility, that would put it well into the category of visual flight rules so long as the ceiling was at 1,000 feet or better.
It wasn't true. Kennedy had 17 years' experience, over 300 hours of flight time, enough to qualify to become an instructor. He had recently taken the performance test to get his instrument license, allowing him to fly blind in the thickest fog, and passed. But the weather was clear, and he was legal to fly even with his old license under visual flight rules. So why did this mysterious person named the family say it? Are there members of the Kennedy family who enjoy Kennedy bashing? The description of Oswald mysteriously going out over the police radio indicates that the killers had infiltrated the Dallas Police Department. This baseless false report suggests that the killers have some of their people identifying themselves as the family and spreading lies. But for now, let's simply make the point that the person calling themselves the family and telling these vicious lies about John's license is also the source of the story that there was no flight instructor. And now let's have a good hard look at the question of whether there was a flight instructor on the plane. The early report that there was indeed a flight instructor on the plane came from an entirely reliable source, Carol Radewell. Remember how the FAA ignored all the calls from the family and now claims that no one from the family ever told them anything about a plane being missing? Radewell is the clever and resourceful family friend who called the Coast Guard at 2 a.m. while other family members were sleeping. Radewell told the Coast Guard there was a flight instructor on the plane, but how could she know? She wasn't on the plane. The NTSB says that no cell phones were used after the plane was in the air, so how could she know for sure what changes may have taken place in the moments just before takeoff? These are very good questions, and it's clear that she couldn't know for sure if there was a flight instructor on board, but neither could anyone else. No one could know for sure. She was guessing. But all guesses are not created equal. There are a dozen good reasons for her and you to think that there was a flight instructor on that plane. John always had a flight instructor. It's just a fact. In the weeks after the accident, the NTSB investigators could find no one who had ever known of an incident where John flew his new plane without a flight instructor on board. As far as anyone knew, John never flew that plane without a flight instructor. There was a reason for this. John had owned his plane for a little less than 2 months. It was much more powerful than his old plane and had lots of high-tech safety features like a very sophisticated autopilot that could help him fly much more safely once he learned to use these sophisticated safety features. So he needed a flight instructor to teach him to use these fancy guidance systems. It's just a fact. It had been an unusually hazy summer. John had flown to Martha's Vineyard 8 times in the previous month. Of course, each time he had a flight instructor with him, but on 5 of his 8 most recent flights, visibility was so poor that it would have been illegal for John to fly without a flight instructor because his license was for visual flight rules only, meaning visibility of at least 4 miles. In Caldwell, New Jersey, as John was arriving at the airport, the afternoon was already turning extremely hazy. So John had every reason to think that he was going to need to have a flight instructor with him on this flight in order to be strictly legal. And according to all of his flight instructors, he never broke the rules and was always very cautious in his decision-making. So for John to have taken off alone, flying into weather that looked hazy along a route that he knew usually had poor visibility, would have been totally unlike him. We mentioned earlier that John and his sister-in-law, Lauren Bissett, arrived at the airport at 7:30. Witnesses say Carolyn arrived 15 minutes later at 7:45, and yet, While conditions worsened, as the skies became more and more hazy as the sun went down, the three of them sat around waiting for 45 minutes until 8:30 before taking off. Why? What were they waiting for? Can anyone suggest a more likely explanation, or any other reasonable explanation at all other than that they were waiting for the flight instructor to show up? But suppose the scheduled flight instructor had not shown up. This would not be a problem for John. He routinely called them at a moment's notice for any sort of emergency.
Clark, somebody originally said that he had a flight instructor because he was concerned about the cast on his leg. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I heard also someone suggest that he had a flight instructor with him because he is working on an instrument rating. And that's how you work on an instrument rating. You fly with a certified flight instructor who sits in the right seat. You sit in the left seat, and as you normally would, and you fly, and the instructor's there to guide you and to take over, frankly, if if you get into any trouble. So those could be the two reasons there was some suggestion or speculation that he might have had a flight instructor.
Let's take these two reasons one at a time. The second one first. Kennedy was working on his instrument rating, but he had passed the written exam. He had passed the performance evaluation, but he needed to log hours, so that he had every reason to fly with an instructor and no reason to fly without one. And now let's get back to that first point.
Clark, somebody originally said that he had a flight instructor because he was concerned about the cast on his leg.
Mm-hmm. In fact, Kennedy had the cast removed from his ankle the day before, but he was still on crutches. He did not need his feet to fly, but he did need them to move the plane around while it was on the ground. Flying with the injury was not impossible or even dangerous, but it was inconvenient. And what do millionaires like John buy with their money? They buy convenience. It would have been much more convenient for John to have a flight instructor along. But we're just getting started with his foot injury. You see, lots of people who cared about John were worried about him flying with a broken foot. It may not have been a real threat. You don't need your feet to fly, but it was an obvious problem that easily attracted people's attention. The Boston Globe for July 19th quotes a Canadian business associate who says that John told him that, for the time being, he'd rather fly with a co-pilot because his broken foot made it difficult for him to operate the pedals controlling the rudder. Richard Blow, his friend and co-editor at George Magazine, had lunch with John on Friday afternoon, the day of the crash. Blow describes their lunchtime conversation and says that he told John he was worried about him flying with the injured ankle. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm flying with an instructor." And what do you think his wife is going to say? Here you have a guy on crutches because he crashed his mini-plane 3 weeks before. Every time Carolyn looked at him, what did she see? She sees a guy on crutches because he crashed his mini-plane 3 weeks before. How likely is it, do you suppose, that his wife is going to get on his plane with him without a professional pilot on board? You do the math. Ask any married man if you need help. The chances of her getting on that plane are a lot less than zero. It is incontrovertible that in the last seconds before takeoff, Kennedy may in fact have taken on a flight instructor. How can anyone say for certain that he didn't? Until the wreckage and the flight log were recovered. Oh wait, they claim they didn't recover the flight log. That means there's no official record of who was on the plane. And it's well recognized that in ocean disasters, just because they didn't find your body doesn't mean you weren't there. For example, when they finally located the wreckage, the Coast Guard and the Navy scoured the bottom for every piece of available evidence. Thousands of small pieces were recovered. Nevertheless, in spite of their search, one of the seats is missing. This seat wasn't eaten or dragged off by sharks. It's rather extraordinary that it should be missing since all the other seats were trapped in the wreckage. How did this one get loose, and how did it get away? A minor point, maybe. The major point is this. If a large, durable, inedible piece of the plane is missing, why not a body, which could certainly have been dragged off and eaten in the 5 days that it took to recover the bodies? So, strictly speaking, without the official flight log showing who was on the plane, even today it would be irresponsible for anyone to try to state definitively that there was no flight instructor on board that plane. We cannot say for sure. We just don't know. Radewell may have been only guessing that John Kennedy Jr. had a flight instructor on the plane, but her guess is supported by an enormous amount of evidence. And while Radewell could not have known for certain that there was a flight instructor, the likelihood that John would have had a professional pilot on board is overwhelming. So then why did all the news reporters, every one, throw out Radewell's story in favor of one that could not be verified then and cannot be verified even now? Oswald was arrested because he matched a description that came from out of nowhere. Unseen forces, invisible to us even today, infiltrated the Dallas police and planted this description. Who, calling themselves the family, told the outright lie that John did not have the necessary license to fly, and at the very same time began spreading the utterly baseless story that there was no flight instructor. And why did all the news accept this baseless story? Are you starting to detect a dark presence at work here? The lying of Colonel Rourke, the FAA saying that they didn't get any of the many phone calls the family made, the incredible 15-hour delay in sending search craft to the crash site, the mass of other missing pieces. This information is disturbing for what it suggests. It smells really bad, but the outline of what's really going on is far from clear. Let's see if we can sharpen the picture to get a better view of what's going on and who's involved. In their final report, a year after the accident, the NTSB featured the dramatic story that one of John's flight instructors had offered to fly with him, but that Kennedy told him that, quote, he wanted to do it alone. This story dominated the news about the final report, as well it might. Stories of Kennedys killing themselves are red meat for the press. They love it. Another Kennedy turns out to be a careless, irresponsible, stupid bastard who killed himself and his lovely wife. Too bad about her. But wait a minute. If this is such hot stuff, and it is, how come it didn't come out in the days right after the crash? The government did a better job than the media in digging up this story? That's a little strange, isn't it? I can answer that question. Yes, it is. So maybe we need to have a closer look at where this story comes from. ABC, the LA Times, and everybody else got their information from the NTSB final report. But this doesn't tell us very much. For example, who is this second CFI? What did he say, and when did he say it? Well, the certified flight instructor, or CFI, is named Robert Morena, and according to this memo, written 6 months after the accident, he told the NTSB about this conversation he had with John Jr. on the morning of the day he died. This is real live drama, eh? You offer to fly with someone of JFK Jr.'s stature, and he turns down your offer of help, and then he crashes. Wow, that would be hard to live with.